name is Peter Goldsworthy, the GM of Startups at LaunchVic. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we are all meeting today. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to people from First Nations communities joining us today. Welcome to everyone that has registered for this event. This is our last webinar in our current AgTech series, supporting the growth of the AgTech sector here in Victoria. In September last year, LaunchVic announced a $2.2 million grant partnership with Agriculture Victoria with the specific aim of boosting the number of Victorian AgTech startups and to build entrepreneurial capability in this critical sector. Today's session, we continue exploring opportunities for Victorian entrepreneurs to break into AgTech by deep diving into the current challenges facing our food system, how agriculture technology can be leveraged to solve these challenges, and the global trends driving the need for innovation in this space. We're thrilled to have Michael Macalino joining us today and congratulate him as the newly appointed Managing Director of SVG Thrive. While Michael is a newcomer to Victoria, his experience spans over 15 years, applying technology to agriculture and food systems to help agri-food tech startups commercialize and scale their innovations to redesign the food system. Michael is deeply engaged in the development of the agri-food tech ecosystem as co-organizer of the South Australian Agritech Meetup Group and involvement in several ecosystem building initiatives, including Oz Agritech, Evoke Ag, Sprout X, and Farmers to Founders. Michael aims to raise awareness of emerging technologies and their potential to build sustainable food system as an advisor to several investors, corporate and government ecosystem development initiatives. Before I hand over to Michael, I want to run through some housekeeping. We have a Q&A channel, so please send through your questions on this and I will moderate these towards the end of the session. The chat channel is the best way to communicate to fellow attendees. Please use this to share information with each other. Okay, let's get started. Michael, we had a great conversation on Tuesday. I personally really enjoyed the backstory of how you became so interested in AgTech, and I think that would be a great starting point to kick this off, and I'd love the audience to hear that story as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for the invitation to join this webinar, Peter, and really looking forward to running through this. So yeah, back in sort of 2017, I was coming off of 15 years running my own businesses. And so I built 5 companies over that 15-year period. And I really looked at a whole range of industries. I didn't really know what was next. But what I had enjoyed was using technology to make things more efficient. And when I was starting to have a look at different industries to apply my sort of skills and experience at, agriculture was something that I sort of got pulled into. I'd done some work with some wineries in South Australia and did a bit of work with Jurlique as well. And, you know, really enjoy the outdoors. So I found that agriculture was sort of pulling me in. And there were some interesting challenges to solve. So, you know, being a technologist, I started going down a bit of a rabbit hole, started listening to lots of podcasts like Sarah Nollett's AgTech So What podcast. And then, yeah, just started meeting with lots of farmers. And I've actually got a funny photo in the slide deck, which shows the first grower day that I went to. But yeah, basically just went on to lots of farms, had a chat to lots of farmers, and thought this was a really interesting sector where there was some big challenges to solve, but also some interesting technologies that were, you know, at the early stage of commercialization that could be applied. So at that time, I was working with BDO and started pitching to them that as BDO, we could really support the development of agritech in Australia. And that's basically what I was working with over the past 4 years with BDO. I led their agri-food tech part of their business and have worked with, you know, as you mentioned in the intro, lots of different agri-tech companies and different programs over that time. So that's kind of the journey for me into agri-tech, and looking forward to building on that through today's presentation.
Want to share your presentation? I think the audience is eagerly awaiting.
Excellent, no worries at all. I'll get that up and running. Cool, so up and running with that. All right, so today going through breaking into AgTech. So This, in many ways, is sort of built off of my journey in terms of how I got into agtech 4 or 5 years ago, but also to sort of share some of the recent developments. So the agtech ecosystem has evolved dramatically, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years. The first real sort of seeds of this were really around 2018, 2019. And we saw things like Evoke Ag start to happen. So let's get underway, and I'll run you through agtech and sort of how you can be involved in it from an ecosystem perspective. So it's really important for us to start with, what is agtech? And it's called a lot of things: agtech, agritech. But really, the way that I like to frame it is we're looking at the food system. So we're looking at agriculture, and then we're looking at the way that we actually produce food. And even more and more these days, how that food is distributed and sold at retail. So agri-tech, in its commonly understood term, is using advanced and emerging technologies such as sensors, artificial intelligence, big data, biotech, and robotics. And what we're ultimately trying to do is achieve more with less. So I like to start with a bit of a history lesson. Because I think there's a common misconception that agri-tech is this new thing. The technology has never been a part of agriculture, and that all of a sudden, we've just woken up one day and gone, what, we should probably use some technology in agriculture. But technology and agriculture have been, a part of each other for over 100 years. If you have a look back at industrial agriculture, so this is sort of pre-1900s, around the turn of the 19th century, we started to see subsistence agriculture turn into industrial agriculture. So moving away from villages and sort of a few small farms around a village to much larger parcels of land. And that started to develop. And what we saw in 1903, the development of what was known as Haber-Bosch process. And what that allowed us to do was produce synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. So before that, we'd really been limited in terms of what we could grow by what we could actually use as fertilizer. So we had a lot of manures, natural manures from animals and so forth. And that was the way that we were able to fertilize our crops. With synthetic fertilizers, what we're able to do is basically scale up production of food. And without the Haber-Bosch process, we probably wouldn't have been able to actually sustain the population boom that we had in the 20th century. So that was a really important piece of technology that enabled us to grow food at scale. And then that actually had a much broader societal impact. If we then have a look at the 1920s, the internal combustion engine, which had a lot of advancement through World War I, was then used in tractors. We could then go from horses to horsepower. We could attach larger implements onto tractors, again, able to plow more land, harvest more food from more land. So there's this common thread of technology enabling us to produce more food, is sort of the common thread that we see over the decades. Then in the 1960s and 70s, what we saw was a whole range of new chemicals. And what these chemicals were then used for is basically protecting our crops. So this is where we're able to, minimize crop loss through, herbicides and pesticides are able to, stop, pests and disease from deteriorating crops. Again, allowing us to produce more food from less land. And this brings us to now. And this is what we're going to be discussing in more detail today. But really what we have now is a digital revolution. So, we're now having a look at the impact of data and software and how that data and software can be used to make better decisions and how it can also be used to automate the way that we produce our food. And the reason we need to automate it is really to be more efficient. So having a look at the macro trends in agriculture. So there's some real driving forces, and this is a lot of what I sort of started to see when I did my initial research on the sector a few years ago. These are the big problems, and these are spoken about very commonly around our broader societal sustainability issues. But agriculture is one of the largest emitters of CO2. Around 35% of global CO2 emissions come from the food system as a whole. So that's everything from growing our food, to transporting our food, to processing our food and the manufacturing and so forth. So there is a massive amount of CO2 that is emitted by our food system, and that is one of the largest macro trends that's really driving agricultural innovation. We've also then got depleting natural resources. So the fertility of our soils around the world is depleting, and in some ways we have rising salinity or just basically land that we no longer sort of can sustain crops. And in some ways what we're seeing is some of that land that's no longer productive being returned to be more more native scrub, etc. And that's actually adding to biodiversity. So it's not always a bad thing, but what it does do is it takes productive land out of the system. So we need to find more productive land. We've then got obviously limited water, in places like California and also Australia recently. We've obviously seen massive droughts, and we've seen that we don't have an endless supply of fresh water. We've seen a shift in consumer demand, and what that is really driven by millennials, and increasingly we're going to see Gen Z have greater demands on how our food is grown. They really want to know, was this grown sustainably? What were the inputs? What is the carbon input for producing this food? And what happens is that then gets pushed back down the supply chain to farmers and the farming systems and how those farming systems operate, because retailers are going to increasingly need to be able to show this is what the supply chain looks like. This is basically how that food was grown. These are all the inputs. This is the sustainability credentials of that. And we're seeing a lot of discussion around ESG, and that's really being driven by expectations of our society. Political tensions. I think we're all aware that around the world, there are a couple of pretty important things that are happening around the world. And I think we've seen that with the Russia-Ukraine situation. When Russia invaded Ukraine, what that did is it impacted the cost of producing food. So gas is used in the production of fertilizer, that went through the roof. So fertilizer went through the roof. What that means is that farmers aren't using as much fertilizer, which means that we have lower yields, which means that there is less food in the world. And that adds to food security. Probably not for a country like Australia, but for a lot of countries in Africa, there is a potential that there will be food security issues around the world, which has impacts in terms of security around the world. We have civil wars break out over food. So political tensions are something that we need to be considerate about in the food system. Generational change on farm is something that, I think will become a bigger and bigger influence. And from a technology perspective, we don't have as many people living in our regions. We used to have the sons and daughters would take over the family farm. That isn't happening as much. So what we're seeing is this corporatization of the farming systems. We're seeing, going from private to corporate, and that does have an impact because there's just no one to actually take over the farm. But we're also seeing that farms are becoming more expensive. So it's harder and harder to actually get into agriculture. And then finally, what we've seen is basically fossil fuels. So most agricultural inputs have some type of derivative of fossil fuels incorporated in that. So there is a complete rethink that we need to have in terms of the actual fossil fuel inputs into almost every input within agriculture. So everything from fertilizers to transport to the way that we wrap our foods for transporting plastics, etc. All of those are derivatives of fossil fuels, which all need to be rethought. And that's an opportunity for entrepreneurs and agri-tech companies to actually rethink all of those things. So a lot of ag tech is really the convergence of technologies. So we often hear these Industry 4.0 technologies, and this is really what we're talking about is this convergence of things like cloud and sensors and artificial intelligence. On their own, these technologies don't really mean much to farmers and don't really have much of an impact to the food system. But what we see is that these technologies, which all started to sort of come to maturity, both in terms of capability, but also in terms of cost around, from 2012 through to, 2018, there was a massive amount of development in these core technologies. And over the past few years, the reason we've seen the development of ag tech advanced so much is that we've seen these technologies start to converge and be integrated in a way that they can actually produce meaningful outcomes for the industry. And what that is really into what I refer to as innovation platforms. So the ones across the top, sensing, analysis, and autonomy, these really refer to improving current farming systems, improving the way that we currently produce our food and fiber. So what we're having a look is the way that we sense information. You know, how do we get everything from soil moisture to weather data to machine data, analyze, and actually, first of all, we need to understand what's going on the farm. And the cost of sensors has come down dramatically. The capability of those sensors has come back, has increased dramatically as well. And what that means is that when we come to analysis, we've got a lot more data. We've been able to obtain that data much more effectively. We're then able to have better models that can actually have a look and analyze farming systems and provide insight to farmers in terms of how to optimize their production. So this is where, you know, you've got your software, you've got things like AgriWebb and data farming that are taking huge amounts of data collected from anything from a soil moisture sensor through to satellite sensors, machine sensors, bring it all together, provide insight to farmer. And then finally, we have autonomy. And autonomy is really what we're looking at to, you know, reduce the cost of farming, but also address some of the challenges in terms of just actually getting fruit off the tree. So when we had COVID, you know, a lot of fruit in the Riverland and in Mildura was left on the tree. So orchard basically could not find enough labor to go out there and pick all the oranges and mandarins, etc. So if you can't get it off the tree, you can't then, you know, turn that into revenue. So autonomy is there to address a massive labor shortage across agriculture. And that's something that's going to continue to sustain. But what we've also got to consider when it comes to autonomy is that if we can take the human out of the process of harvesting or seeding, what that does, it totally changes the business model of agriculture. It changes the cost dynamics of a farm, and it enables things to be done much more regularly. So quite often when a farmer needs to make a decision about going out and spraying a field, you know, that's not just the input of what they're spraying, it's diesel, it's labor. So autonomy enables that to, you know, be completely rethought. And companies such as Swarm Farm Robotics, from an Australian perspective, are probably leading this. But we also have small robots as well. So small robots in the field that are basically carting produce back and forth from, you know, from a vineyard, you know, maybe back to the packing shed. And then the row below, synthetic biology, controlled environment agriculture, and logistics. This is sort of like the next generation that we need to consider. So synthetic biology, we have, you know, the core technology from CRISPR. Synthetic biology is really us rethinking how we can leverage biology and redesign at a you know, DNA genetic level how microbes and how biology can be used in agriculture. And some you know, applications of this is really synthetic biology being used in removing the cow. So if you have a look at things like VOW foods, they're basically going, we can produce meat without an animal. And what, you know, we've got around the world is alternative proteins where, you know, in order to remove methane, some people are basically saying, you know, what we actually can do is we can actually remove the need to produce an animal in the first place. Cows are not particularly efficient at turning grass into meat. So if we can take a stem cell and put that in a metal vat, feed it with some sugars and yeast and all kinds of different things, we can actually produce meat without an animal. Now, we're probably a few years from that becoming mainstream, and the costs of those things are still pretty high. But we've also got the ability to produce different microbes that can actually draw nitrogen from the atmosphere. So instead of having to go and actually produce synthetic nitrogen the way that we have for years, which has got some fossil fuel inputs, we can actually grow special microbes that in their own right can actually draw nitrogen from the atmosphere, put that into the ground. We've then got the ability to grow food indoors at scale. So we've seen a lot of different vertical farming applications And those vertical farming operations take a lot of different technology, everything from the way that the lighting systems work, through the way that the environment is controlled. There's opportunities for companies to take research into different types of genetics that's optimized for indoor growing, and then how we grow the food, how we package the food. All about that is around efficiency. So there's a lot of opportunity around all of these innovation platforms to take what is a core technology that could be licensed, or say a piece of research, and instead of it needing to go out into the field, it could maybe have a different application in a vertical farm, for example. And finally, logistics. I think logistics is often overlooked. Logistics is something which will have a massive change as we move from your internal combustion engine powered trucks to electric, but logistics is also needing to go from, we are onshoring a lot more of our production. I think as we de-globalize over the next few years, what we'll start to see is, a lot more food manufacturing happening in Australia, and that needs to be shifted around. We also need to figure out how we get the distance, the food miles down. So how do we get food from where it's produced to where it's consumed in the most efficient way with the least amount of carbon being emitted in that process? So where are we at in terms of the adoption of agtech? So we're really, I would say, in this early adopter and in some ways approaching the chasm. So not all sectors in agtech are at the same place. We're seeing, I would say, the livestock industry, the grains industry are probably a lot more advanced than horticulture in some ways. But really what we need to consider when looking at your technology, at your company, is how ready are your users to actually adopt? A lot of agriculture sits in the sort of the pragmatist and the conservative bucket. And that means that it's going to be really quite hard for a lot of these agri-tech companies to get to a level of scale where they can attract investment, but also a level of scale that they can, start to build teams and operating capability around the amount of revenue that their user base is generating. So it's really important when you're considering building an agri-tech company and going to market to understand where in this adoption curve is your target user. From a sector perspective, but also from a user perspective. A family-owned farm, although there is a need for technology, the capability to adopt that technology is often not there. So what we're often seeing is that agri-corporates, so if you think about your large organizations like Costas and Driscoll's, and Treasury Wines and these large corporates, these are often the biggest adopters of early stage technologies because there is an economic incentive for them to do that, although often the need is actually on a private farm. So it's really important for you to understand that adoption curve and where that sits. We have a look at investment from an agri-tech perspective. It has increased dramatically over the past few years. Currently, we're sitting at around $8 to $10 billion a year being invested into agri-tech, and that includes everything from on-farm agri-tech to supply chain technologies to alternative proteins, synthetic biology. So massive amount of investment. We see around 26% of the investment dollars going into ag biotech, about 30% going into controlled environment agriculture. And most of the exits starting to happen around acquisition. So a lot of big agri-corporates, your Syngentas, your Bayers, etc., they're actually actively looking at agri-tech companies, and the exit is often going to be being acquired by some of those companies rather than going and actually being an IPO, etc., from an exit perspective. And Australia's kind of missing out on this. We have improved, but if you have a look at that chart, we're not on there. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be on there. So we have all the components in Australia to be a global leader in agri-food innovation. We have, an $80 billion a year agriculture industry. So we have an industry that is big enough to support companies to a pretty large level of scale to actually develop. There are enough customers. There are 90,000 odd farms in Australia, and that is a sector that is growing. Within Australia, we have around $1.3 billion that goes into our RDC system, which is our research development corporations. There's basically 15 of these research development corporations around Australia for every agricultural sector. And their job is basically to undertake research on behalf of industry. And there's about $1.3 billion worth of capital that is in that every year. Universities, CSIRO, there is a huge amount of research. And in Victoria, there are 15 research and development type organizations and facilities. So there is no lack of research. The problem that we have is that commercialization. How do we actually take research and commercialize that into sustainable outcomes that have business models that actually apply to industry? So when we have a look at where all of this is coming from, is the agri-tech ecosystem. So the agri-tech ecosystem is kind of unique. And really the uniqueness comes from the play and the integration between startups and founders and industry. It is absolutely critical that startups and the founders really find ways to integrate with industry as soon as possible when they're starting to develop and commercialize. We've got, on one side, you've got your entrepreneurs, on the other side, you have your farmers. But to get there, what we need is basically investors. We have government providing policy and framework and funding to support those early stage innovations. We have infrastructure such as smart farms to be able to trial a lot of the agri-tech. And then you have this ecosystem of traditional agriculture. And a lot of startups, I think, sadly, they think, we're going to go in there, we're going to disrupt. We don't need all this old agriculture, but that is your customer. And it's really important for you to understand the way that agribusiness works, the way that agribusiness associations work, the way that grower groups work, because these are the people that provide the ability to translate new technologies to farmers. They provide trust, they provide education. So it's really important to understand that this ecosystem of different stakeholders in the agri-tech ecosystem is critical to everyone working together to take ideas, find where they have a practical home in the food system, and then apply that to farming systems. So this is where I started when it comes to agri-tech. This is the first grower day that I went to, and you can probably guess which one my car is, but it is so critical to get onto the farm. And I felt so out of place when I attended this grower day. This was a grower day out in a place called Langholm Creek. It was a whole bunch of farmers coming together to have a look at all these different types of compost and which compost led to the best type of growth, which compost led to the best type of water holding capacity, etc. But what I got out of this day was, over a few cups of international roast in a shed, is I got to connect with farmers. I got to understand the way they acquired technology, what technology they tested, how they interacted with each other. It was one of the most amazing learning experiences, and I still do this to this day. I go and try and get on farm at least once a month. And anytime a farmer invites me, if I meet them at a conference or I meet them at an event and they invite me to attend their farm, I always take them up on that offer, because this is where you see the real world. Is there connectivity? What happens when you put your device on the farm and spiders and dust and all kinds of stuff gets into it. So highly encourage you to get on the farm whenever possible. Probably, if you're breaking into ag tech, one of the most eye-opening experiences that you can have. And what we've seen is this growing ecosystem around agri-tech. So, back in 2018, there wasn't much happening. But what we've seen is things like Evoke Ag and Advanced Ag start to bring people together. Evoke Ag is a conference of 1,500 people. They come around from around the world. They come together. They spend 2 or 3 days speaking about agri-tech. That is a great way. If you're new to this space, get along to something like Evoke Ag. You'll meet so many people, and you'll understand all the different challenges that are emerging in the food system and where there is an opportunity for your innovation or your skills or experience to be applied to actually solving some of these challenges. There are meetups around the country. So I run the South Australian Agritech meetup with a few friends, but there is a meetup group in Victoria run by SproutX. So the meetup group is a great way of the ecosystem coming together to meet other founders, to meet farmers, to meet investors, to meet corporate agribusiness. And, you know, again, these often actually go out into the regions. And, you know, I know from our experience, we've had grower groups attend that, and it's a great way of connecting. So drilling down into what's happening in Victoria. As Peter mentioned, there was a $2.2 million initiative to boost the number of startups happening in Victoria. And Josh will drop this link into the chat, which is basically the Agriculture Victoria current strategy for growth of agriculture in Victoria. And uniquely, it has basically taken agriculture and agritech and created this strategy which makes the two one and the same in a couple of ways. And that's important. A couple of states have actually said agriculture's got its roadmap and agritech have got their roadmap. And the two worlds have sort of been you know, split apart. But I think it's incredibly important for us to think about agritech and agriculture in the same way. So this particular report, definitely go on and have a read of it, and you know, you can download the PDF. It looks at how what are going to be the objectives and the strategies to increase adoption of agritech and actually increase the ability for that agritech to be fit for purpose, which is incredibly important for adoption. If the technology is not fit for purpose, it will not be adopted. And farmers just simply will not even have a look at it unless this thing is robust. And a lot of the strategies around commercialization, around different accelerators, are around improving the quality of agritech. What we're also having a look at in this report is how we enhance commercialization of research. So taking that pipeline of research and basically turning that into commercial outcomes, and we'll touch on that in a moment, and then delivering skills of the future. Skills is one of the biggest gaps in the agritech ecosystem, because in order for advanced technology to operate on farms, we need engineers in the regions, we need software developers in the regions, we need all of these skills to take that quite often very advanced technology and turn that into something that can actually achieve things in farming systems. Needs different sets of skills. So skills are something that are addressed in this strategy, and it's something that you should consider when developing your agritech company. Is how do you actually support that agritech in the field? Who is going to fix it? Who is going to deploy it? I'm going to skip ahead because I know that we're maybe a little bit short on time, and Peter, please jump in and stop me if we're running out on time.
No, we're fine, Michael. Yeah, you can, it's fine.
Awesome. Cool. So having a look at Victoria from, you know, an initial go-to-market. So if you're an agritech company, if you're a founder, you know, you really need to have a look at where you can grow your company, where you can get that initial traction. And Victoria provides a really good basis for that to happen. You know, in order to have a venture scale company, you always need to be considering global aspirations, how this technology, how your company can actually have global impact, but you need to build this somewhere. And Victoria provides quite a lot of infrastructure for you to do that. So from an industry perspective, you know, we've got around an $18 billion agricultural sector in Victoria, but we also, from a food perspective, and food is often overlooked in terms of that food processing side of things. It's a $41 billion food processing sector at the same time. So in terms of, you know, raising that initial bit of capital, and, you know, investors asking a question, you know, well, you know, unless you go global, this thing is not going to have legs. You have a pretty sizable initial target market in Victoria that you can go after. We've then got 81,000 people employed in agriculture in Victoria. Now, this is another important part, and it goes back to what I was saying about skills before. Agritech companies need to bring people into them quite early that have got an understanding of farming systems and understanding of agriculture. You know, you want to make sure that the people that are going out there selling your technology have the ability to communicate and speak the language of agriculture. And it is, in many ways, there is a a certain level of trust that needs to be established with farmers. So it's really important, if you're looking at business development people, you want to find people that are maybe, you know, ex-elders or ex-nutrient, you know, that understand, you know, that you don't go and try and sell something to a farmer in the middle of harvest. You know, those are the small nuances that are really important to consider. So there are a lot of people who are already working in agriculture that can be brought into your startup. And finally, as I touched on, we've got a lot of infrastructure happening. So the ability to deploy and test your agricultural technology on one of the 4 smart farms is incredibly important. You know, you want to try and get it into the field, but it's often hard to actually convince a farmer to let you put your technology on their field, you know, on their commercial operation. So these smart farms are a good way of actually getting your technology into the real world, getting it tested and so forth. Cool. So as I mentioned earlier in the piece, you know, and as Peter touched on as well, $2.2 million has been made available through the Agriculture Victoria strategy to support agricultural innovation in Victoria. Now, as mentioned in my bio, I've been really fortunate to work with SproutX and Farmers to Founders, and also know Emma from Rocket Seeder really well. These programs are there from pre-seed and also seed programs. So they're there from, you know, supporting ideation, supporting really, really early stage companies. So these programs, highly recommend, have a look at the websites of Farmers to Founders, SproutX and Rocket Seeder. Those will provide a good outline in terms of how they support early stage entrepreneurship in agritech. And I know that the programs there are definitely world-class. They help founders to, you know, connect with agriculture, to understand the business model of agritech, figure out how to raise funds for this. You know, is this technology going to be venture scale, or is this more of a small business? You know, I think it's important to recognize that not every piece of agritech is going to be something that is venture scale that you go to, you know, raise venture capital for. There's a number of companies that I've worked with that are, you know, farmers that have developed something on farm, that think other farmers could use it. They've come into these programs and they've been able to develop their business model, figure out, you know, how to build that in a capital effective way. And that's what these programs are there to support. As Peter mentioned, I've just come on board as the Managing Director for SVG Ventures Thrive in Australia. So Victorian government has you know, supported SVG in bringing Thrive to Australia, and my role is to establish that here. One of the things that we're going to be doing is running an APAC accelerator, and we've opened up applications for our accelerator program this week, and we'll be speaking about that more over the coming couple of weeks. But this program is really there to, you know, be the next step. So for a lot of companies that are coming out of SproutX and Farmers to Founders that are sort of, you know, getting to $1 million, $2 million worth of revenue, they've got products in market, the next step is then going global. And SVG are, you know, one of the largest agritech investors globally. They have a massive network in the United States and Canada. And I'm going to be really excited to take 10 companies from our accelerator over to the US in March. So, you know, what we see is that these accelerated programs are there for every stage of development, and to really make sure that the pipeline of agritech in Victoria is well established and well supported, so that it can then go global, and then we can start to get some, you know, really amazing unicorns out of Victoria. And then finally, to wrap up, is where to go next. So in Australia, we've got some amazing support from the likes of the Oz Agritech Association and Evoke Ag. So the Oz Agritech Association was set up in early 2020. There's now, I think over 100 members of Oz Agritech, and it's really the governing body that represents the interests of agritech companies in Australia. So Tracy and the board at Oz Agritech, they do an amazing job of, you know, promoting agritech in Australia, you know, really speaking to federal and state political interests to really make sure that, you know, we're represented, to make sure the policy to support agritech entrepreneurship in Australia is supported. Then we also have Evoke Ag. So Evoke Ag is a conference, but it's also a growing community. around entrepreneurship in agritech. It's basically there to bring everyone together at the EvokeAg conference, but then throughout the year, keep that happening. So a lot of agritech companies are able to have their articles and promotion around what they're doing through the media side of EvokeAg, which is very effective. But also what we see in the Oz Agritech side of things is a Slack channel, which has got over 700 people talking about agritech, and it's a great way to connect with everyone there. So the top really good way of connecting with the ecosystem, understanding the ecosystem. So go and have a look at both Oz Agritech and EvokeAg. Then when you need to actually see, the idea that you have, your innovation, has someone done that before, or what exists? Go to AgTech Finder and also GrowAg. These are two directories of sorts that basically show the majority of ag tech that's happening in Australia. So what are the companies, what are the technologies? Most of them would be listed within either AgriTech Finder or GrowAg. So go and have a look at those just to see what's happening. And then finally, Agriculture Victoria and LaunchVic have quite a lot of resources on their websites, but also, as mentioned in the earlier slides, strategy and policy to support the growth of agtech in Victoria. So there's information already on there, but I'm sure that there'll be more information coming as this sector grows in Victoria. So some really good resources to have a look at, and that's it. So yeah, please feel free to reach out. My details are on the screen, and I'll hand back to Peter.
That was fantastic, Michael. I'm sure for all the founders on the call, super excited to get a top line look at the way you think about ag and some of those emerging trends. We've got some, and it sort of highlights just by the questions that have been coming through. What's really exciting is that we seem to have a representation from not just the founders, but some of the large agri corporates and farmers on the call as well. So I'll jump right in so we can maximize the time with Q&A. And the first one is from that founder perspective. From your perspective, who is the right type of founder that should or could get into agtech?
Yeah, so what I've found is actually a lot of founders coming from research. So a lot of people who have come from a research background, they have often got a PhD in some type of aligned research, and what they want to do is basically turn their research into a company. And that's what we're seeing the majority of them. It's probably one of the things that I've enjoyed most is working with often quite technical founders who are new to business, new to entrepreneurship, and it's sort of igniting this spark. They know their domain incredibly well. They know how their research or technology can be applied to agriculture, but what they're missing is that commercial acumen. And that commercial acumen can be taught, and that's what we're doing. In a lot of things with SproutX and Farmers to Founders, it's basically going, how this technology works. What we now need to do is figure out how we wrap a business model around that, and how we actually do things like raise capital and go to market. So the technical side of things can't be overlooked. I think that the really impactful technologies do come from people that have a deep understanding of the problem domain, but also how to scale that particular technology. So yeah, highly encourage people that have got technical or research backgrounds that think that they can be applied. Entrepreneurship is for everyone, and there is plenty of support to be a technical founder, but be the CEO. So yeah, plenty of opportunity there.
Yeah, that's great. And then the second question is coming from the angle from an agri-corporate. So they want to understand, we want to be stronger leaders, innovators in agritech. What would be your key advice to get plugged into the best and brightest in emerging in agritech?
Yeah, so this is going back to the ecosystem discussion, is coming to these events. So things like EvokeAg, coming along to meetups is a great way to connect with people as well. I like to try and do these things in an informal way. It's amazing what happens when you have a whole bunch of entrepreneurs and also some people from ag corporates few beers, a bit of pizza, and conversations get flowing. There's been a few times where I've had to sort of like, push people out the door because we're 2 hours over time. So coming along to those events is a really good way of connecting and understanding what's happening. And also, if you have facilities that you can actually bring agri-tech companies into, bring founders into, please open them up. Invite us to come in and have a look, because what we often see is that those ag corporates can bring us in, show what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, but also show where the challenges are. And that access is something that's incredibly impactful in terms of getting that dialogue going between challenge and solution. But also from a perspective of SVG Thrive, we do work with a lot of the agribusiness corporates. We have clients like Bayer and Kubota and so forth, and we have formal mechanisms to actually try and, at the moment working with Dairy Australia. So Dairy Australia are looking at how they can address some of their initiatives. So we're understanding what those initiatives are, and we're actually going and finding agri-tech companies and bringing those two parties together.
Yeah, that's great. The third question comes from the farmer's perspective. So we're currently trying to convert from dairy to horticulture, growing berries for Driscolls, using protected cropping and hydroponic technologies, and having a lot of trouble attaining capital due to financial institution risk departments, not having the appetite for the risks they see in the latest technologies. Mm-hmm. When do you think the adoption of this technology from, that capital point of view, when do you think it's going to become more of an acceptable risk?
Okay, so if we're having a look, if you're a farmer that needs capital to make this transition rather than a company, you're not going to be having a look at the venture capital side of things. But there is increasingly funds that are being set up around the country. We have almost like family office type money that's starting to have a look at where they can actually invest in next generation farms. So traditionally, farming has been, your family farm, the finances of the farm with no real external parties. In order to make this transition, it is often very capital intensive. And that's where we're seeing almost the corporatization of the family farming operation, where it is actually a corporate entity, although still private, that is put up, and then third-party investors are basically investing into that entity. And that really requires a business model for the farming operation that shows, like anything, how are we going to make money? How are we going to market ourselves? What is going to be the point of difference? But that capital is often coming from high net worth individuals who are investing into funds. So off the top of my head, I think of things like there's one called Ag Food Fund. There's also Duxton Capital. These are formal agricultural funds that are out there looking for opportunities to invest in farming operations, but those farming operations need to be looking to the future. They need to be having a look at how they can be sustainable in the future and how they can leverage these technologies. And often it's the technologies that are providing the efficiencies to provide the level of margin that's necessary to provide the return to these funds. So that would probably be where I'll be looking at is some of these agricultural funds that are emerging. And I think that there are more and more of these coming out, because I think that there is an opportunity to go from your traditional family farm to your sort of in the middle corporatized private farming operation.
That really ties in with the next question. In your macro trend slide, you mentioned that there's generational change on farm, and it's one of the driving forces. So are platforms that connect aspiring farmers with retiring farmers and investors like Cultivate Farms, are they having much of an impact on the intergenerational land transfer yet, or is it still early days?
It was still early days. I don't think we've really seen too much happening yet. There is in the United States a platform called Farm Together, which does enable people to basically invest into farms as an asset class, and that new sources of capital coming in does enable easier access. but it's still very hard to get into farming. It's incredibly expensive, and it comes back to that previous question: is where do you get the capital to start? So I think that is something that does need to be addressed. The succession. There's a lot of conversation around succession planning in farming. Some of the models that are starting to enable this is actually leasing of the land. So the farming family still owns the land, but then they lease that land to an operator, and that operator will then work that land for a number of years from a leasing perspective, and then that will help them to generate the capital needed to actually get into purchasing some farmland. Now, I think that there will be some innovation in this space. I think that how we free up capital to enable people to actually go and buy this, whether it's that same model where it's a number of parties coming together, pooling capital, and then going and purchasing land. Ultimately, in order for that to be a sustainable venture, there needs to be a massive amount of technology that's considered in it. So, you need to be thinking about autonomy from the ground up. You need to be thinking about, your farming systems, your crop types, etc., from the ground up. So, it's a problem that needs to be addressed, and I think it's actually a pretty big threat because, in some ways there are, not people within the family to actually take over. So what happens is the default ends up being a corporatization of that. You have your large corporates come in and buy that farm. It's not a bad thing. It provides an exit for that farming family. But I think that there is something about the fabric of agriculture in this country that is so much tied to family farming. And a lot of our regional towns really rely on that family farming. So I think we need to keep that balance between privately held agriculture and also corporate agriculture as well.
Yeah, it's super interesting that it's already in the US is already a platform that is doing that and is, and it's the same sort of trend that's emerging here. So from the founder lens here, so it's commonly said that every farm and every farmer is different. What are your tips for how ag tech startups can build a scalable solution which resolves the various nuances across sectors, markets, and geographies?
That's a really good question, because a lot of agri-tech companies try and do it all. And I would very much recommend doing the research. So there's a lot of information out there. A lot of agricultural departments, the RDCs, will put out a lot of information and data around the size of their sector, how much is produced, where it's produced, etc. So that's the first step, is actually doing the research, actually find out where is there economical opportunity for you to go and pursue. And then having a look at your technology and having a look at the challenges that your technology solves, and where there is the best alignment. So sometimes I see companies go, we're doing horticulture and we're doing viticulture. They kind of are the same, but they're also very different. So as a startup, you have a limited amount of resources, and you really need to go, we're going to basically focus on refining the technology in grapes. We're going to figure out, how to be the best harvesting robot for viticulture. And then doubling down on that, there is always enough customers, in a region, say the Barossa Valley or, the Hunter region or whatever. Go and base yourself out there. Just basically go deep until you get that product market fit. And if you're not getting that, don't be going, oh, it's not working, I'm just going to go to oranges. Because the distance from viticulture to oranges, in terms of the way that you have to calibrate your technology, the business relationships you have to understand, the economics between viticulture and horticulture is often very different as well. That chopping and changing between sectors is often what kills agri-tech startups. So before you embark on going to market, do the research, attend events, go to these grower days. The grower days are where the users are, and speak to them. Before you even, develop something, go and speak to your end user and see, if I was to build this and I was to charge that, would you buy that? Would you see value in that? And do that in those different sectors, and then double down and basically go for that until you get that product market fit.
That's great advice for any sector. And, we commonly say that in all of our programs that you should be speaking to at least 50 customers before you go build something. So yeah, great advice. Justine is looking for a comparison of AI adoption across different parts of agriculture.
Okay. So AI is an interesting thing in agriculture. There's a lot of startups that have tried to push AI into agriculture, and it has had limited success. And the reason for that is, for AI to be effective, we need good quality data. We need a large amount of data, but often we need connectivity. And connectivity is probably the biggest barrier. So if you're having a look at where you want to apply AI, you really need to consider how you're going to get that data at the rate and at the quality that is actually required to produce a quality outcome for decision support. So where there is probably the largest uptake is in things like horticulture and also in these controlled environment sectors as well. So these are, sectors in agriculture where they're often close to connectivity, because they're often, close to regional centres, etc. But also the farming systems are fairly repetitive and they're very structured as well. So, in viticulture, there is actually a project that created a mapping framework for a vineyard. It's called Collaboraculture. So it took a vineyard and it took that and basically turned that into a data structure. And you can actually get this on GitHub. So if you have a look at Collaboraculture, there is effectively a database schema of a vineyard. And what that means is basically when technology is being deployed into a vineyard, whether it is a robot, whether it is a sensor, whether it is a remote sensing data from space, there is uniformity around the development of that data set. And once you have uniformity of the data set, you have different companies that are calling a vine row, that are calling, a Shiraz, not, different types of varieties. That uniformity of data is what is critical for AI to work. So again, going back to research, having a look at where you're going to be able to obtain quality data, and that will probably be in either the viticulture sector, the horticulture sector, or in some ways the grain sector as well, because you've got large amounts of data being collected from the likes of your John Deere systems and so forth, but getting that data is often very hard. The other thing to consider from an AI perspective is you're going to be limiting yourself quite often to your larger agri corporates. So your ability for the customer to actually leverage that is probably going to need people internally within their organization to actually interact with that system, because often the AI systems are the user interface, the user experience is often quite technical and sometimes beyond the capability of a private farming operation. So if you are having a look to do something with AI in agriculture, you probably do want to have a look at your entry-level customer is going to be at a certain level of scale, and what does that mean for your business model, and what does that mean for the maturity of your product before you actually start to have those discussions.
There are so many gold nuggets that have been within this conversation, Michael. And I think this is one of the ones where everyone's going to need to go back and rewatch the recording of this. Sadly, we're out of time now. Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing your insights and experience with our audience today. For everyone on the call, you'll be able to log in and go to our website, launchvic.org/agtech, and you can find links to this recording. And for more information about how to break into agtech, you can also look at the pre-accelerator programs on our website. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. And one last thank you for Michael.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.